Mind and Matter by G. F. Stout. Book 2, Chapter 5. Materialism Incompatible with the General Order of Nature. 1. Nature of the Argument. According to metaphysical materialism, mind and mental occurrences are produced by purely material conditions. What I have to urge is that this involves an altogether inexplicable breach of continuity with the order of the physical world as a system of laws which science constantly seeks to discover, and on which it depends for its precision and certainty. As it is sometimes held that there is analogous discontinuity in the transition from non-living to living matter, it will be well to consider the biological before passing to the psychophysical question. 2. Order of nature in inanimate matter. Physical science in general, being founded on manifold, relatively independent data supplied by observation and experiment, has a corresponding multiplicity of independent starting points, each raising distinct questions. Yet these different questions cannot, in the long run, be answered apart from each other. Each, when followed up, finds its answer only in the answers to others, and the answer to each again raises other questions which require to be dealt with in a like manner. The aim throughout is to connect particular facts with each other as special instances of general laws. Further, the scientific ideal is never satisfied by special rules applying to limited groups of phenomena occurring only occasionally, e.g., the rule that water rises in the common pump when the piston is raised. Such empirical laws themselves constitute problems which can be solved only by deducing them from, or exhibiting them as special applications of more general laws, and ultimately of laws which enter into the general course and constitution of the physical world as a whole. Thus, the several physical problems are ultimately parts of one problem, and the several physical sciences are ultimately parts of the one science, which seeks to disclose a single comprehensive order of nature, a hierarchy of laws connecting with each other the particular data of observation and experiment. In this way, physics and chemistry gradually develop towards the ideal of a single continuous system within which special laws are shown to hold between determinants of certain ultimate determinables, such as motion, mass, and energy, and to be deducible from the laws of these ultimate determinables. The ultimate determinables are themselves correlated and mutually complementary as essential aspects of the material world as a whole. Footnote. I do not commit myself to any definite view of what the ultimate determinables are. The history of science shows that our attitude on this question ought to be tentative and provisional. Compare, for instance, Descartes, Newton, and Einstein. End footnote. This order of nature is not only presupposed by science as what it seeks to discover, it is also essential to the growing precision and certainty of inductive generalization. And inductive generalization increases in probability not only with the number and variety of empirical cases which it covers, but also with the degree of determinateness with which it enables us to anticipate the specific differences which distinguish different cases. The greater the differences, and the more exactly they are deducible from the same general formula applied under diverse conditions, the more probable is the general formula in its generality. It is so because it accords not only more widely, but more closely with facts. Water rises to a certain height in the common pump when the piston is raised. This is a relatively crude generalization, which may mislead us if, for example, we expect the water to rise to the same height at the top of a mountain and at sea level. There is great advance in trustworthiness as well as in precision when we passed the law that any fluid within a Torsyllian tube rises until its weight balances the weight of the air pressing on the fluid outside the tube. Even in pre-scientific induction, the principle of determinateness is operative and of essential importance, though in a less exact and systematic way. It is involved even in the primitive process through which the individual man or animal learns to adapt himself to his immediate environment, and to control it by varying adjustment of the degree and direction and combination of his movements and motor efforts to varying conditions of the same general nature, e.g., in lifting weights, in pushing or pulling, in balancing himself. Without such plasticity, he would be unable to keep himself alive and to satisfy his elementary needs. It is indeed partly provided for by instinct, but, in the higher animals at least, the instinctive equipment is only a preparation for learning by experience, by inductive inference. Is it true universally that the general propositions with which induction is concerned assert a relation between a variable A and a variable B? I maintain that this is universally true, even when we rely mainly or wholly on constant and frequent repetition of instances in which an A is followed by a B. Such induction by simple enumeration, A-B, need not indeed enable us, except perhaps in a very vague way, to connect A1 with B1, A2 with B2, etc. Nonetheless, it is essential to the inductive process that A and B shall be variable so that further inquiry, if carried far enough, will inevitably lead to a search for some principle connecting specific values of A with specific values of B. Otherwise, the repetition of instances on which the induction depends would be impossible. Competent logicians now agree that mere repetition as such has no evidential value. The circumstances under which A and B are repeated must so vary as to make the principles applicable which are presupposed in Mill's canons and methods of agreement and difference. But the point which I am insisting on is that there must be not only variation in the accompanying circumstances under which A is followed by B, there must also be variation in A and B themselves. As it occurs in any one particular instance, an A is a highly complex set of conditions. All of them are necessary to determine the occurrence of a particular B, as it occurs in the particular instance, e.g., the death of some particular man through disease, accident, or old age. The conditions fall under observation only partially and imperfectly. Even with advancing knowledge, they can never be specified with complete fullness and exactness. Now, if A is not a variable, its recurrence in another particular instance can only mean that it is precisely duplicated in all the complexity of its determinate detail. If there is the slightest difference in any respect, there is no longer an A, but a P, which may be followed by a Q, quite diverse from and unconnected with B. But precise duplication and the perpetual variety and flux of the material world can rarely, if ever, take place. If it ever does take place, we cannot ascertain by observation that it does so, and its antecedent probability is vanishingly small. The conception of the order of the physical world as a system of laws in which the more special are specifications of the more general seems not only to be presupposed in the ideal which science pursues, but also in all inductive generalization, even the most rudimentary. But are we therefore entitled to hold that the more special laws are deducible from the more general? This is a question which we are faced when we consider the peculiar nature of vital process. 3. The distinction of animate and inanimate matter. The matter of which living organisms are composed is ultimately the same as that found in lifeless bodies, and the occurrences which actually take place in it are, so far as science can ascertain, mechanical and psychochemical occurrences. They do not occur in isolation, but form an integral part of the general course of nature in the material world as a whole. Life consists in a series of transactions between living organisms and their non-living environment, e.g., assimilation and dissimilation, respiration, etc. In particular, there seems to be no independent source of vital energy apart from the energy which is continually being redistributed within the physical world in general. Nonetheless, there are very important differences. Physiochemical processes take place within living organisms, which it seems practically hopeless to attempt to explain by deducing them from the more general laws that hold also for inanimate matter. There are two ways of accounting for this. It may be regarded as due merely to the immensely greater complexity of the conditions operating in vital process, or it may be referred not only to the complexity, but to the particular nature of organic life as exhibiting a teleological order such as is nowhere discoverable except in living matter. Those who accept the first alternative are said to take a mechanical view of life. Those who accept the second are called vitalists. The advocate of the mechanical view holds that the special laws distinctive of vital processes are nothing but special applications of more general laws, which hold equally for non-living bodies. Within the inorganic world, the same system of ultimate laws may yield very different results as the conditions of their application vary. Thus, the law of gravitation contributes to explain such different facts as the fall of bodies on Earth, the tides, the orbits of the planets, etc. According to the mechanical view in biology, the peculiar set of conditions distinctive of vital process is only an extreme, an immensely complex instance of such variations, involving no ultimate laws and no ultimate factors, which are not common both to animate and inanimate matter. Hence, for the mechanist, it is at least a permissible hypothesis that life may have developed, according to physical and chemical laws, from a previous state of things in which there were no living bodies. The vitalist, on the contrary, holds that for those parts of the material world which are alive, laws are operative which, in spite of their special and limited application, are nonetheless ultimately, and not simply derivative. They are held to be ultimate not merely in the sense that it is practically hopeless, owing to the complexity of the conditions, to show in detail how they can be derived from more universal principles, but also that by their own intrinsic nature, as teleological, they are essentially incapable of being so derived. Thus, if the vitalist is justified, there is, at this point, a real breach of continuity in that order of nature, which physical science seeks to discover. Its advance in this direction is barred not merely by the complexity of the problem, but in principle. Which of the two parties is right, we need not here consider. What does require to be emphasized is that vitalism is radically inconsistent in principle with materialism. The only support for vitalism is the peculiar and immensely complex way in which partial processes within the living organism are interrelated, interdependent, and co-adjusted with each other, and with the environment, so that they apparently tend to realize ends prescribed by what can only be conceived as a plan or scheme. The assumption from which the vitalist starts is that this teleological order cannot, owing to its intrinsic nature, be accounted for by merely material conditions, however complex. What he needs, therefore, is precisely what metaphysical materialism denies him, an immaterial agency, which in some way directs, controls, and regulates the course of material process in living bodies. And this agency, if it is to work in the way required of it, must be of the nature of mind. It is not indeed necessary to posit a distinct vital principle for each organism guiding its physical and chemical reactions, but without the operative presence of mind in nature contributing to determine the course of events, the conception of a tendency to the fulfillment of ends is quite unintelligible. Wherever, says Dr. Haldane, there is need for an extra supply of oxygen, as, for instance, during muscular exertion, the membrane assumes an active role and pushes oxygen inwards without regard to the mechanical laws of diffusion. Footnote: Life and Finite Individuality, edited for the Aristotelian Society by H. Wilden Carr, 1918, page 14. End footnote. Here, something takes place just when it is needed to sustain the general life of the organism, as if it were intended to meet the end. And such an adjustment is a characteristic expression of the teleological unity of organic life. But what is the event itself, which is described as an act of the membrane pushing the oxygen inwards? It does not follow from the mechanical laws of diffusion. But, being a material occurrence, it must consist in mechanical or chemical or physical process, or in something of the same general nature. How, then, is the action of the membrane conditioned if immaterial agency is excluded? We cannot say that the mere truth of this proposition, if the membrane acts in a certain way, a certain result, an increased supply of oxygen to muscular tissue, will follow, is of itself an operative factor. Apart from the agency of beings who strive after ends, things do not happen simply because they are required in order that something else may happen. But if we entirely exclude any animistic view of life, or of nature in general, there are no conditions left which are not material, and these must be fundamentally of the sort which we describe as mechanical or physiochemical. The action of the membrane must be determined by its own previous state and constitution as a material thing, and by the whole complex of material factors and processes within and without the organism, of which it is a part. The materialist, then, seems logically bound to take the mechanical view of vital process. But the inverse does not hold good. The mechanical view, as I have defined it, does not necessarily imply a materialistic view of life. It does so only if it is supposed to be sufficient of itself to account for teleological order. Otherwise, however true it may be, footnote, to me it seems true, end footnote, it is not philosophically adequate. Merely material process being incapable by itself of accounting for teleological order, a factor must be presupposed which is not material, but essentially akin to what we know as mind. But, given such a factor, there is an end of materialism. There is no attempt to make mind a product of merely material process. 4. Life and mind. If we follow up materialism consistently by excluding from our conception of life all reference, however vague, to any factor which is not material, it becomes entirely illegitimate to think of life as a transition stage, bridging what would otherwise be a gap between inanimate matter and mind. In this respect, it makes no difference whether or not the materialist regards the distinctive laws of vital process as deducible from more general laws. Being thus of a piece with material process in general, it is at least an intelligible question whether they can, in principle, be accounted for as special applications of the same ultimate laws operating under special conditions. But when we turn to the psychophysical problem, such a question not only cannot be answered, but cannot be intelligibly asked. Experiencing is essentially disparate and discontinuous with merely material happenings, whether these take place in living or in non-living bodies. Further, for the purpose of the argument, it makes no difference what we comprehend under the term material, provided always that we rigidly exclude any kind or degree of experiencing. Wherever, in the course of nature, purely material conditions are supposed to give rise to mind, the transition is equally abrupt and unmediated. It is not a whit easier to suppose that what happens in a human brain of itself produces thought, feeling, and will, than to suppose that they are produced by a piece of clockwork, or by the burning of a candle, or by the chemical union of oxygen and hydrogen. There is no variation in the conditions corresponding to variations in the supposed consequences. Wherever mind is taken to begin, it bursts into being like a shot out of a pistol that is not previously in the pistol. To speak here of emergent evolution is nonsense. Metaphysical materialism excludes the possibility of anything out of which experience could emerge or evolve. 5. The ontological incoherence of materialism. What the materialist asks us to believe is that a certain complex of physiochemical conditions occurring in a limited part of certain limited and transient bodies has effects utterly disparate in their fundamental nature from any effect which physiochemical conditions produce elsewhere. The difference is not a difference between determinants of ultimate determinables, such as mass, energy, motion. What is supposed to come into being is an absolutely new determinable, which by its intrinsic nature cannot be a determinant of a higher determinable. It does not help at all to assume a special law, which is not deducible from more general laws. What materialism requires is a special law which has no sort of connection with more general laws. In other words, the supposed production of mind by matter is entirely foreign to and discrepant with the whole order of nature in the material world. To use a metaphor due to J.F. Ferrier, it is as if a player at billiards should win the odd trick by a cannon off the red. Is this apparent incoherence to be simply accepted without further inquiry as an ultimate matter of fact warranted by scientific evidence? The answer is that it is not a scientific fact at all, and cannot therefore be an ultimate scientific fact. To suppose otherwise is radically to confuse science with philosophy. The student of physical science, as such, confines himself to his proper task of discovering the order of sequence, coexistence, and covariation of phenomena, treating mental occurrence merely as one set of phenomena among others. From this point of view, so long as he strictly abides by it, all that he can say is that he finds as a matter of fact that mental phenomena begin, continue, and cease when and only when certain material processes begin, continue, and cease. If, however, he also asserts that this is the whole relevant truth about the real universe, he is no longer asserting a scientific fact, but an entirely untenable metaphysical theory. He is asserting fundamental incoherence as an absolutely ultimate fact. Ultimate not only in the sense that he cannot account for it, or even in the sense that no one can account for it, but in the sense that it is in reality absolutely groundless. This position is so intolerable that it has rarely, if ever, been maintained in its nakedness. Materialism, in its most usual form, is an attempt made from the standpoint of physical science to avoid, or rather to evade it. mental phenomena are treated as in some unexplained way unreal, as what Hobbes called phantasms or apparitions, as merely unreal appearances that do not, it is assumed, enter into the executive order of nature at all as real antecedents or real consequences. They are thus regarded as epiphenomena, absolutely dependent on certain material conditions, but making no difference to the prior and subsequent course of events, any more than the shadow of a body influences its motions. But the perceptions, thoughts, feelings, and strivings of experiencing individuals do really exist. If they are not real, then we have no ground for asserting that anything is real. Metaphysical materialism, therefore, entirely fails to avoid the fundamental incoherence of scientific materialism. On the contrary, it aggravates it by asserting the miracle of creation out of nothing, where the creator is not an omnipotent being, but a finite and transient complex of material phenomena. 6. The logical incoherence of materialism. I have pointed out in Section 2 that the possibility, or at any rate, the degree of certainty of inductive generalization depends on the order of nature as a system of rules in which the more special are special applications of the more general. In the supposed production of mental occurrences by purely material conditions, this order is interrupted completely and in principle. Hence arises a corresponding logical discontinuity. From the standpoint of metaphysical materialism, there is no way of accounting for the validity of that common-sense system of beliefs concerning the connection of individual minds with their bodies, which is involved in all social intercourse, and in all interpretation of the bodily behavior of men and animals as expressing their mental life. But this common-sense system of beliefs is presupposed in all scientific treatment of the psychophysical problem, and in all philosophical theories about it, including materialism. Hence, materialism cannot overthrow it without overthrowing itself. Our interpretation of the observed bodily movements of others as evidence of the existence and nature of their mental process is, in some way, grounded on the experience which each of us has of the relation of his own bodily movements to his own mental processes. It is very commonly held that the existence of any mind other than our own can originally become known to us merely through an inference by analogy from what each finds to be true in his own case. This position has been disputed for reasons which seem to me valid, but any alternative view assumes an original animism. Footnote. See Book 4, Chapter 6, Section 7, and footnote. Which the materialist, approaching the question from the standpoint of physical science, must regard as illusory, even if he admits its existence. Hence, we might join issue with him by denying that on his view, the individual could have any ground whatever for presuming the existence of any mind other than his own. But, as this is not the point in which I am interested at present, I concede provisionally that the supposed inference by mere analogy is, in principle, possible. What I here insist on is that the mere analogical inference from an isolated instance can yield only an extremely slender degree of probability for the boundless range and complexity of the cases covered by the common-sense system of beliefs. From this point of view, it can supply, at the most, only a tentative hypothesis to be verified by its detailed application in accounting for and enabling us to anticipate and adjust ourselves to the bodily behavior of men and animals. Such verification logically presupposes a system of ultimate variables and specific rules logically analogous to, but not the same as, those which constitute the physical order of nature. It presupposes that the variable interests of experiencing individuals as such, defined and guided by their variable knowledge and belief, are in some way, footnote, not necessarily that they are operative by themselves, My own view is that they are so only in union with bodily processes, within the primary unity of the embodied self as known to us in self-consciousness. End footnote. Really operative as antecedent conditions, determining in correspondingly variable modes the course of physical events. It presupposes that these events have a character and order which make it improbable and, in sufficiently complex instances, utterly incredible that they should take place independently of the operative presence of individual minds in connection with individual bodies. The ultimate principle of highest generality is that the interest of the individual at any moment of his life history tends more or less successfully or unsuccessfully to fulfill itself. The principle thus expresses the entirely distinctive way in which mind, owing to its intrinsic nature, contributes to determine the course of events. It is lost altogether if, in stating it, we attempt to substitute anything else for mind. In its detailed application, the general formula covers a boundless range and diversity and complexity of specific cases, specialized by the variable nature of the relevant interests and of the circumstances which condition the various ways and degrees in which they fulfill themselves or fail of fulfillment. The whole system of common-sense beliefs implied in social intercourse rests on the fact that proceeding on this principle, we are able to explain and anticipate the bodily behavior of our fellow men, and to cooperate with them in thinking and willing, and in the pursuit of common ends. If metaphysical materialism is true, this procedure of common sense ought to be impossible, or, if we suppose it possible, it must be fallacious, so that its apparent success can be nothing but a casual coincidence, and cannot logically warrant any inference to new cases. For its indispensable presupposition is that mind, as such, does really, in a quite distinctive way prescribed by its own intrinsic nature, play a part in the determining what takes place in the material world. But this is precisely what the consistent materialist is bound to deny. The unconditional and immediate dependence of mental on material process, which he asserts means, if it means anything, that the very existence of each mental occurrence at any moment depends exclusively on material events taking place at that moment. This is the only view warranted by the evidence to which he appeals, if the evidence has any value at all. He believes, on the findings of science, that mental phenomena begin, cease, continue, and vary when and only when certain nervous processes begin, cease, continue, and vary. Treating this finding of science as a complete account of what really exists and takes place, he translates it into a metaphysical theory by asserting that the material events absolutely produce the concomitant mental events. On this view, when a man, as we say in common parlance, moves his hand, his volition cannot in any way be a determining factor. The sole determining factor is the nervous process, which gives rise to the volition as an idle accompaniment, an epiphenomenon. In deciding whether we shall follow common sense or the metaphysics of the materialist, there can be no room for hesitation when once the nature of the issue is fully understood. In the first place, we are incomparably more assured of the general truth of the system of beliefs implied in our daily dealings with our fellow men than we can be by any metaphysical theory which conflicts with it. In the second place, all scientific or metaphysical inquiries concerning the general connection of mind and body in men and animals rest on the assumption that the connection is already known to exist. If we ask how this can be known, the ultimate appeal must be to common sense. Materialism, in undermining common sense, undermines itself.